My name is Kelly Sayre, and welcome to the IHL Group webinar, Debunking the Retail Apocalypse. A great deal has been made in the press recently about retailers closing stores. What is often lacking in these stories is the other side of the coin, in that large number of retailers that are actually opening stores. So our webinar today will address the reasons for the negative narrative and present the evidence that shows the retail apocalypse headline is off base. So in fact, although retail is changing quite a bit, it is growing and is quite healthy. The slides are a subset of the report called Debunking the Retail Apocalypse, which you can find under the Research and Advisory tab at our website, which is ihlservices.com. So our panelists today are Greg Busick, President of IHL Group, and Lee Holman, Vice President of Research and Product Development. So let's get started here by thanking our sponsors. Without them, we would not have been able to undertake this giant effort needed to complete this research. So specifically, our title sponsors, AT&T, Fujitsu, Cayenne, and Aptos, and our gold level sponsors, AdSpace and Level 10. We truly thank you. So today you will have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar interface. Simply click on the Questions tab in the sidebar of the webinar. And we encourage you to ask your questions throughout the webinar, but what we'll do is we will try to address all the questions during the Q&A period later in the call. So without further delay, let me turn it over to Greg Busick, President of IHL Group.
Thanks, everybody. I don't want to presume that everybody knows about IHL and who we are with a webinar such as this, because the attendance is quite a bit larger than normal. We're a boutique analyst firm that focuses on the retail, hospitality, and CPG market. We help those retailers and hospitality providers make better IT decisions through a managed RFP process. We certainly have syndicated research and data services. One that will be focused on quite heavily here would be our Sophia data service that was part of this project. Then we have your typical advisory programs, and then we do custom research. So that's IHL in a nutshell. Now to the research. So we want to start off, I want to start off today looking at, the background for this negative narrative that's out there. What's driving that? What got us to this point? And then what are the major things that are happening in the marketplace today that have built up this retail apocalypse narrative that is out there today? The first thing is we've got to rightly view the data that's out there. Retailers are closing stores every year. And it's actually smart and very wise for retailers to close underperforming stores very, very quickly. One of the mantras since the Great Recession has been learn to fail quickly. And so opening stores, if you had a bad store, bad market, close that store very quickly. That's quite normal. I think the biggest thing that happened this year, it's the first year in a while that the FUNG data, FUNG Global Retail and Technology data went negative, where the closings actually eclipsed the openings. FUNG, they're friends of ours, do a terrific job on what they cover, but they really only focus on some specific areas, not the entire area of retail. And unfortunately, without that kind of definition around it, what happens is the area that they focus on is the area that has had the most negative news. They focus heavily on apparel, department stores, and then supercenters and warehouse clubs. They don't go as deep in food and drug, mass merchants, and some of these big categories that are growing very, very fast. They cover it, but not to a very deep level. And they do not cover the convenience stores, fast food, or restaurant areas that most vendors in the market, and particularly the U.S. Census, covers as retail sales. Excellent research on large public and private companies in those core heavy focused areas, and they've been doing these announcements for opening and closings for years, so they become sort of like the proxy for retail, but unfortunately it's not as wide as retail really is. So what's happened is, absence of any further data, the press used this data to project all of retail, and unfortunately that's not a true view. So here's the latest data that they had. The press has focused heavily on the store closures, which are up 178%. And in most stories, you won't even find the data on store openings, the part to the right here. which is the 3,300 store openings. Now, once again, these are in those core fashion segments, department store segments, supercenter warehouse segments for the most part in this area, or large public companies. One of the other things that's been happening since the Great Recession is we've had cheap money. Whenever you have interest rates that are historically low, it creates an environment among public companies as well as private equity companies to expand, expand, expand. And we as an industry are guilty for expanding at the expense of customer service in many cases. There have been many of these chains where private equity got involved, said, hey, it works in 100, let's put it to 500 stores, and the next thing you know, that retailer is out over their skis. They didn't focus on the customer, they focused on the expansion, and the net result was any pebble in the road caused them to go off the rails. And we're going to see that when we get into the unique retailers that we're talking about today. Next, we are tremendously overstored right now in the United States, and that's been part of the issue. We actually have 10 times the space per capita than Germany, which is pretty extraordinary. In the United States, because of cheap money and because of the availability of land, property developers have been developing malls at a rate 4 times the actual population growth since 1975. This has caused an overexpansion of properties, making it extremely easy for retailers who wanted to expand to go into those properties. But in many cases, you had one mall, and less than 5 miles away, you had a whole new mall that was being produced there. So that is a big reason why we got to this narrative and we've got empty mall space today, is simply we have too much shopping space for all the retailers to fill. Next, we have the rise in fast fashion. Zara, H&M, Forever 21, not only have been expanding in stores, expanding in the United States, but changing the model when it comes to fashion. Instead of buying outfits that you'll wear for a year or more, you've got outfits you're going to wear 3, 4, 5 times that are changing very, very quickly. The lead time has gone from idea to shelf from 9 months down to 21 days. And because of that, that has completely disrupted the fashion side of the retail business, particularly hurting not only the apparel retailers, but also department stores and their clothing there. Next, specifically to department stores and drugstores in particular, we have the impact of the cosmetics and the beauty market going out to separate stores. Companies like Sephora, Ulta Beauty, Lush, The Body Shop are opening individual stores instead of being sections of department stores. So those are big changes that have affected the margins and also the traffic within department stores. Next, let's talk about the consumer and what's really going on in the marketplace on a macro level today. Since 1996, so the overall inflation has been about 55% on consumer services and goods. To give you an idea here, over on the left side, we see that the inflation rate of 55%, all of these necessities, childcare, healthcare, food and beverage, and housing, all surpass the overall inflation rate. And anybody that has a child that's in college knows college tuitions and textbooks have been driven up significantly. But if you look at the right side, you start to see what's been really happening in terms of income growth since 1996. And it's a totally different picture by when you look at things by quintile. So the lowest 20%, their income only grew 44.9%. The second quintile, 54.7% at a median income rate. The third, 60.2. So we have 50% of the U.S. population that has not been able to keep up with inflation on key necessities. And that's a big part of what's going on with the change in retail that's happening. Now, to go further into that, let's look at the middle class. So this chart on the left shows us what the middle class percent of the population is from 1971 to 2015. So you see this red area was 61% of the population in 1971, now only 50% of the population in 2015. Now when it comes to shopping, you go to the right. The middle class controlled 62% of the wealth in 1970, but only 43% of the wealth in 2015. Most of those properties and most of those malls were built in areas that were originally designed for middle class housing, and that has caused issues as well. Finally, we've got debt, and particularly student loan debt and auto debt have been driving up significantly since 2008. Student loan debt has gone up over 105%. So consumers are being squeezed, particularly consumers in the middle class are being squeezed. So those who used to shop at department stores and specialty stores are now looking to off-price retailers like TJ Maxx and Ross stores, fast fashion like Zara, etc., and then buying cosmetics and beauty from those separate stores instead of going into department stores. So when you look at what fuels this narrative, you've got low interest rates, the fast fashion, the cosmetics, the smaller middle class, the rise of online, which we really haven't even gotten into yet, and incomplete data that's been out there in terms of the overall area of retail. So what's really happening? Let's talk about what's really happening in retail. And the reality is retail sales are up. Retail sales are up $121.6 billion in U.S. through the first 7 months. Now let's put that in perspective. Okay, $21.6 billion is the equivalent of the annual retail trade of the Netherlands. That's our growth. So we are growing quite well, but it is not all the same segments. C-stores and mass merchants are doing outstanding. Your home groups, your home furniture stores are doing great. They're up $14 billion in DIY and furniture sales. Men's clothing is actually doing well, and toys is actually doing very well year to date. Not so well, department stores and soft goods. That's the area that we're seeing. What's interesting though, and you'll see this when Lee starts getting into the deeper data, apparel sales are actually relatively flat. We've got a lot of stores that have announced closings in this area, but the sales are actually flat. And that signifies to me some bad business models more than weakness in the overall industry or a weakness in spending among consumers in those categories. Appliances, sporting goods, and office supplies, those are down, and those are the areas that are specifically being affected by online sales and specifically by Amazon. When you get into appliances, we had several retailers go out of business in electronics there, that and sporting goods as well. Those lowered the actual overall market for sales because those stores were not there. Online, up 11% for the year. It's 29% of the total retail growth, but it's still only 8.3% of the total retail market in North America. And around that, Amazon's about $9 billion of that total 121.6. So they're getting a lot of blame and a lot of people saying, hey, Amazon's a big part of this problem or whatever, but it's really unfounded in that blame there. Retail overall is growing very well. The shift is occurring because of these other issues. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background on this study, what we're doing, and then I'll turn it over to Lee. So what we did, we used our Sophia data service. We started with over 2,700 retailers in Sophia. Then we narrowed that down to those people who are parents and banners in segments that match the U.S. Census for Retail Trade. Now, what we mean by that is you have a company like Kroger that's a parent company that we have in our system, but we also have Kroger stores in our system. We didn't want to double count those things, so we had to narrow and cut those down. Next, we focused only on companies that had 50 or more stores in those banners, which got us to a subset of 1,803 companies from which to look at that had 50 locations or more in 10 retail segments. Then the way we looked at it was net opens and close for that chain only. So for instance, a retailer, all retailers are closing stores, most retailers are opening stores as well. We didn't try to count they opened 10 and closed 2. We only counted the +8 net difference between those two for that particular retailer. So if it was a net positive, we counted that. If it was a net negative, we counted that. And then finally, we left out a lot of stuff to be purposely conservative in what we're doing here. Because we focused on retailers that had 50 or more stores only, we did not include the mom and pop growth area. And this is kind of important because in 1990, Walmart had 3 supercenters. By the year 2000, they had over 1,500 supercenters. In the meantime, 2 million mom and pop stores went away. What's happening with Amazon, though, is Amazon has grown. They've actually increased the number of mom and pop stores, but we're not counting those here because those mom and pop stores now have a storefront, but they now have access to everybody that's an Amazon Prime member. And as a result, that is actually helping them by selling through Amazon. We also do not include pure play showroom stores. Those stores like Amazon stores, their bookstores and the other stores that they have, excluding Whole Foods, of course, for this. We don't include those bookstores in our count. So anybody that's a pure play e-commerce company that started opening up stores like Warby Parker and those folks, we did not include in here unless they had gotten to 50 stores or more. And finally, it does not include foreign retailers that are operating here in the United States unless they have 50 or more stores in the United States. So we're purposely conservative on that. So getting to the bottom line, what was the actual results? What we found through this research is we had 14,248 opens, 10,168 closures among 1,803 retailers. This is the breakout by segments. Supermarkets, as you can see, department stores and specialty soft goods were the only 2 negative groups. All these other areas were growing. So we have a net opening of 4,080 stores. So I have one more slide because some of you are probably sitting here going, hey, what are restaurants doing in there? And the answer to that question is twofold. Number one, the U.S. Census on Retail Trade is actually U.S. Census on Retail Trade and Food Service. That's how the data is presented there. And number two, this is how vendors, which is how we make our money, have traditionally organized their business to go after the retail and hospitality segments as a combined segment. If you want to get nitpicky and get to the individual numbers, we've got the core retail segments as a plus 1,326 stores and restaurant segments 2,754 stores. And that's for 2017. All indications from the research that we did across these 1,800 stores is actually for 2018, things are going to accelerate. In fact, we just got word today, announcement came out that the GDP grew at a 3% annual rate for the first time today in quite a while. So things are very, very positive, not only economically, but also in retail alone. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee for our next thing here, and I'll introduce Lee.
All right, great. Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure being here with you. Before we get too deep into the data, let me just reiterate a couple of things that Greg mentioned there. For IHL, we look at retail and we look at hospitality. And so typically in our verbiage, we don't use words like vertical too terribly often because it tends to get confusing, especially when we're having conversations with folks that are cross-industry types. So in our parlance, we talk about segments, and that's what you see on the left-hand side of the screen here, superstores, warehouse clubs, convenience stores, and so forth. And this is one of the manners in which we take data from the retail industry and break it down into more manageable pieces. Another way that we do it is, as Greg talked about, we got, for instance, the Kroger company is a parent company, but underneath them would be a various number of banners such as Kroger, Roundy's, QFC, and so forth and so on. And they reside in the food grocery segment. As Greg also mentioned, they've got convenience stores like Tom Thumb and Turkey Hill. They've also got specialty retailers under the Kroger parent company for Fred Meyer's jewelry stores. So they're in the specialty groups there. So basically what we did for the data that Greg described on the previous slide, we took each of those segments and we broke it down according to the number of banners that were opening stores, the number of banners that were closing stores, and we kind of ignored those that were staying flat for the year. presented the data this way so that you can see there's a whole lot more green on this slide than there is red. And when you break down the numbers, what you find is that for every banner that's closing stores this year, 2.7 banners are opening stores. So this is a confirmation of what Greg said earlier. Retail is pretty healthy. In this slide, we take the exact same data and just go ahead and run the ratios for you. So in the case of superstores, they had no banners that were closing stores. So the bottom part of the fraction becomes 0, which means it explodes off to infinity. We cut it short to keep it on the screen here. The way you read this chart is that in food and grocery, for every banner that's closing stores, there are 4.9 banners that are opening stores. That's how you read each and every one of those segments like that. You'll see down at the bottom department stores, which is the only one that does not have a ratio higher than 1.0. Now that's a problem, obviously. Something's going on there because we saw earlier that that's one of the two segments that's closing stores or that has a net negative for 2017 in terms of number of stores. The segment right above that is specialty soft goods. It too has got a low number, 1.3, but they're closing 3,000 stores or so this year. And when we look at this and have a grasp of what's going on, what we see is there are some very large retailers in these segments that are closing lots of stores. There's also some retailers in these segments that are growing very rapidly, and we'll see some of the evidence of that in just a minute. Here is a chart that might look a little familiar to you. It's similar to some of the numbers that the Fung data has shown. And basically what we've got is Dollar General there at the top, and that's a huge number, 1,290 stores. That's the number that they had in their 10K. In their first 10Q of this year, they had already opened 396 stores. So they're well on their way to reaching that 1,290. I think their next 10Q comes out in a couple of days, so it'll be interesting to see what the data says there. Dollar Tree, also in the mass merchant category, 650 stores. These are some really big numbers, and that's why you'll see a lot of green for these guys. Moving down the chart just a little bit, Aldi, you'll see there we're showing 200 there. I believe the Fung data actually shows 400 for the year. What the passage that we captured for concerning their growth indicated that they were going to open 400 stores by the end of 2018. So we went ahead and just split it in two and gave half to 2017 and 2018. So that's why there's only 200 there for Aldi. You see O'Reilly and AutoZone, two auto aftermarket retailers in the specialty hard goods segment. Both of these retailers have been growing their store footprint by leaps and bounds over the last handful of years, especially through M&A activity, where they buy up a smaller player and they rebrand the stores. Interesting thing about these retailers right now, most of their retail sales actually come from local machine shops, mechanic shops, and auto dealers. It's not so much the walk-in customer that drives their sales there. The other interesting thing is the fact that while they're growing their store footprint so big, you'll see in a few slides that their sales have actually declined in the first 7 months of this year. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Moving a little further down the chart, you see Sally Beauty and Ulta. Greg had mentioned these guys a little bit earlier, and we'll see a chart in just a little bit that describes some of the dynamics involved in what's going on with them. Lidl is showing there, the third one from the bottom there. This is the only retailer on this screen that had 0 stores in the country at the beginning of the year. But they've announced that they're planning on opening 100 stores this year, so it'll be interesting to see what the rest of the year looks like for them. All told, these 16 retailers have 4,162 stores. That's a 30 to 40% of the total that we saw from Greg's slide earlier. Now here's the slide that really is the data on this slide is the source of some of the heartache that we had in the first part of this year. Basically, what you see is the top, or well, maybe it's the bottom retailers in terms of store closings. It goes without saying that if you look at the number just up there under the word store, 4,929 stores closed. That's almost half of all the store closings that we counted in this effort. Just these 16 retailers. And if you look at some of the names there, I mean, it's not too much of a stretch to say that some of these guys should have been closing stores throughout the past decade, but have chosen not to. Let's take a little closer look at some of the guys here. If you look at the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth entries there, Payless down to the limited, those are all specialty soft goods retailers. And between them, what is that, 1,500 stores that they're closing? That's pretty much the cause of the red marks that are against them in the negative numbers for their store counts for this year. You'll also see a couple of department store retailers in this list, and they're closing 340 stores between them. Actually, let me say this and reiterate what Greg said earlier. It's not necessarily a bad thing for retailers to close stores. In fact, it's healthy for them to assess the performance of each and every store in their chain and make whatever changes are necessary. If it means closing a store and moving to a different location, that's great because those resources get repurposed. Or if it means investing more in the store to drive traffic to the store, to increase the sales in the store and therefore increase the performance, that's also an option. On this slide, we're looking at restaurants in the same vein as we did the pure retail just a few moments ago. And let me say this, the data on this slide and the next one are, I would consider, just a little bit softer than the data that's found in the retailers, and that's only because there's such a heavy franchise mentality associated with restaurants. Okay, so these are the top top level parent company kind of companies, and underneath they've got dozens of franchisees that are sometimes working at cross purposes amongst themselves in terms of store growth or store decline. A lot of names that you see on the left there that are very familiar. Some of them have been in the news recently, and not for good reasons necessarily. Let me give one shout out to Chick-fil-A. Full disclosure, my family loves Chick-fil-A. We love the food, we love the service, and as an analyst, I absolutely love the manner in which they manage the company. And keep in mind, they are open 86% of the amount of time that the rest of these guys are open. Here's the flip side of the story for restaurants. This is about the first time that I can recall Subway closing this many stores in the course of a year. You look at that number and think that's a huge, but when you realize they've got 23,000 stores or thereabouts in the States, then that percentage is way down there. Starbucks, 379, that has a lot to do with their Tijuana banner. We're not real sure how that's going to turn out for the rest of the year, but I think that number is going to change somewhat. Some of the others that are in that list there, Burger King and McDonald's, both of them closing 100 or 110 stores. There's some aspect of this pertaining to what I just talked about. It's healthy for some of these guys to close stores on an annual basis depending upon their performance. One of the things that you'll notice in the previous sheet, there's a lot of fast food in the growth chart, and a whole heck of a lot more table service restaurants here in the decline side of the equation. Now, here's where we get into just a little bit deeper dive on data for some of these segments. In the case of drugs and cosmetics, the NAICS code for drugstores includes drugstores and pharmacies as a separate code and cosmetics and vitamins as a separate code. And so we separated out that growth of 345 according to those NAICS codes. And what we find is that the drugstores and pharmacies are actually closing 77 stores this year, while the cosmetics and vitamins, the companies that Greg talked about, the Ultas, the Sally Beauties, the Sephora's, these guys, they're growing leaps and bounds. 422 store increase this year, and they're showing a sales increase of 4% up through the first 7 months of this year. That's a huge impact that's happening on drugstores and department stores. I mean, anybody that's spent any time wandering around some of the department stores, especially around the holidays, you can see that the traffic around the cosmetic stores is considerably less than it once was. Looking again now at general merchandise, here we're talking about department stores and mass merchants and supercenters. Dealing with the supercenters first, 82 is, I mean, it's not a big spectacular number compared to some of the others, but this is still significant growth. And the 2% sales growth that you see there, that's a consistency that's happening there with those particular retailers. Mass merchants, those numbers are up in a big way, mainly because of the retailers that we saw already. The fact that you've got Dollar General and Dollar Tree growing so many stores as they did. What's included here also is the number of Walmart's, the original discount format stores that are closing as they are being reopened or repurposed for supercenters. So those numbers are included in here as well. When we look at department stores, the only red numbers on the whole sheet here, it's a tough situation for them. They're facing competition online. They're facing competition from the specialty retailers. We've already talked about the cosmetics and the personal care type of situation. Department stores are really having a tough go, and when you consider the fact that a lot of them are anchor stores and malls, it becomes a ripple effect, because if one of these guys goes out of business or closes a store in a mall, it becomes a ripple effect throughout the mall for every other retailer that's present there. Soft goods. We mentioned earlier about the fast fashion. We'll get to that in just a moment. Again, soft goods in the NAICS codes are broken down by clothing, and then under clothing there's men's clothing, there's women's clothing, there's children's clothing, there's family clothing, and so forth and so on. Rolled up, clothing is down 2,300 stores this year, and that's in spite of the men's clothing growing. They're going in the opposite direction there. Shoe stores is also having a tough go here, and part of that has to do with Payless. They're closing, what was it, 700 stores, I think. That's a really big deal for them. Some of the stores that are closing in the clothing arena, I mean, Route 21 and Ascena are closing 400 each. Gymboree is 350. Limited was 250. Children's Place 172. Pardon me. Those 5 retailers, 1,572 stores closed all by themselves. Again, some big chains closing lots of stores. Jewelry is doing fairly well, a nice 2.6% growth for the year, 138 more stores this year. And then we get to fast fashion. Understand, clothing, shoes, and jewelry all have separate NAICS codes in the federal docket. Fast fashion does not. What's included in fast fashion is also up here in clothing. Fast fashion includes, you know, H&M, Zara, the folks that Greg had mentioned earlier. These guys are showing a growth of 62 stores if we exclude Route 21, because Route 21 is actually going through the very thing that Greg talked about in terms of easy money, fast expansion, and so forth. They're closing 400 stores this year. The killer, though, is what you see on the right-hand side there. Clothing is down 1.1% this year. Shoes are down 0.9%, but fast fashion is going up 6 to 7%, and that's our estimate. That's not a number that came from the Census Bureau. Hard goods. Here we see the same effect in auto parts that we talked about earlier. AutoZone and O'Reilly opening lots of stores, but their sales are actually declining. And part of this has to do with the announcement that Amazon made in the early part of the year saying that they were really going to go after auto parts. Now, I don't know if they were referring to the retailers themselves or just bigger sales of auto parts on their site. That's open to you guys to figure that one out. DIY up 6.8% in terms of sales, an additional 347 stores. People are investing in their homes. They're remodeling. They're expanding. They're doing the kinds of things that you know we've been trained to do through the years in investing in our own personal infrastructure. Furniture, same idea there. Not quite as much growth, but still healthy at 3.8% for the year. Sporting goods. Now this is where it really gets interesting, because Sporting goods, remember last year was when Sports Authority vanished. I mean, there was what, 260 stores or something that just overnight closed up shop. Well, this year, running the numbers, we see a total of +4 stores, which basically means that the store footprint isn't going to change very much at all for the year. But their sales are down 8% plus for the first 7 months this year. That's a really tough spot to recover from. Now, having said that, there are certain sporting goods retailers that are doing fairly well, but the competition online is pretty heavy. I mean, a Spalding basketball is a Spalding basketball. So if you can get it delivered for free in 2 days at a price that's comparable to what you see in the store, why not? Bookstores are having a tough time, mainly because of one retailer, and that's Family Christian. They closed 240 stores this year, but sales are actually up a little bit. And then electronics, this is the area that's really hammered by the closings of Radio Shack and GameStop and H.H. Gregg. I mean, there's a lot of stores closed just due to those 3 retailers. And again, pretty heavy competition coming online from the likes of Amazon and Walmart. I mean, when you can order a 65-inch TV and have it delivered for free, or even have it installed for next to nothing, that's a remarkable deal and something that's tough for bricks and mortar retailers to deal with. Final slide here, we're talking about restaurants. Fast food restaurants, huge growth there, 2,000 extra stores this year. Sales are up 3.2%. We as Americans, we love to eat out. Food away from home continues to be a heavy part of our budget, and bar restaurants are also growing. Not quite, only about 1/3 of the number of stores that fast food are growing, but that's mainly due to the fact that certain of the restaurants in that segment have had to be closing stores over the past couple of years. Still, sales are up about 4%, and that's a decent number for the year. Having said that, you need to understand that in the bar restaurant category, drinking places are there, and their sales are up 16% this year alone. Now, we went back and looked at the data from early October of last year, and I'm hard-pressed to understand what happened in early October last year. So I don't know if it was celebratory or commiseration kind of drinking that's been going on there. But these are the numbers that we see here in the data. And with that, let me pass it back to Greg.
So going forward, what do retailers need to do to effectively compete? And we're going to outline 6 specific things. Number 1, retailers have to transform the customer experience. The customer experience in most retail environments today is horrible. You go online, they treat you like a king or a queen. They know what you like. They know your preferences. They have specific offers. When you go into most retailers today, the associates could hardly care less that you even walked in the door. You're not getting specific offers for how you are as a shopper. Loyalty systems are not put together yet. You have to transform that customer experience. Consumers are spending on experiences and on their homes. Live sporting events, live concerts, those things are up sharply in terms of business. But what is of utmost importance is people want to be entertained and they want to have a good experience, and you have to transform that customer experience. Now, related to that, a big part of the problem with the customer experience is out of stocks. Overall, the industry as a whole is out of stock in 1 in 4 trips by consumers to a store. If you want to go to one of our reports, we have a report called We Lost Australia, which is a worldwide view of the cost of overstocks and out of stocks, which is actually a $1.1 trillion problem. But more importantly, for retail survival, I used to have to shop. Now I have to want to shop. And if I only have a 50 to 75% chance that your store has what I want to buy, if I don't need it immediately at that time, online I can get it shipped to me in 2 days. That is a big problem. So technology such as RFID, so that you can know that if some lady comes in for a size 12 black cocktail dress, you know it's in the dressing room, not it's just out of stock. RFID is a key technology, getting to a single view of your inventory across the chain, save the sale. The ability to attack this out-of-stock problem and converting your customers when they come to your stores is absolutely critical. Third, and we've got a couple of these redlined or in red here, so we'll go in deeper. Decoupling the IT spend growth from previous year revenue. Traditionally, we've only done 1 to 2% of revenue is being spent on IT. That was before Amazon. Amazon spent $15.1 billion last year on R&D and innovation. Retailers cannot expect to compete effectively against Amazon, Walmart, Kroger, Target, and some of these other guys who are spending a huge amount of money on IT transformation in the future if they're not willing to decouple their IT spending to previous year revenue. Next, leverage the cloud as a head start. And we're not going to go into a whole bunch of detail, but you could leverage the cloud not only as a full replacement of certain systems, but also to be a hybrid cloud that provides the interfaces to make your on-premises systems work together to provide that single view of the customer and single view of your inventory that can be used to improve the customer experience. Fifth, embrace mobility. I'll show some data here in a second that explains why that's so critical. And then last, learn from the leaders and what the leaders are doing. So our leading retailers today are spending up to 5 times more on IT than the laggards. So this is a study we did in January. It's about 30% of the folks that are in the leader category on the left in the blue. We had about 28% in the middle that were average, and then the rest were in the below average retailers. Those in the far right in the purple categories of both here, these are the people that when Amazon grows are just going to eat them up. Okay? It's not going to be the people that are over here. These are the people that are investing heavily in systems, and I'll show some specific things that the leaders are doing differently as we go forward here. Next, embracing the mobility. The leaders are those that are growing more than 5% a year in sales. They are 250% more likely to be using mobile devices for their associates. And the impact of that is they're enjoying a 70% higher sales increase than others. So what that means is if the average sales increase is 4%, they're enjoying 70% higher than 4% on that. So, 7%, a little over 7%, or a little less than 7% growth there. That is significant by having mobile devices for your associates so they can do their jobs while they're moving. They can assist customers, etc. As well, mobile point of sale, being able to complete the transaction completely on a mobile device. The leaders are 150% more likely to be doing that, and they're enjoying a 90% higher sales increase when they do that. Now, we're going to have a session, a video with Kelly that will go over how do you do this right. You can't just throw mobile in and expect it to work. There are certain things you have to do correctly to make that work, psychologically with the customers, training with the associates, but also the fact that you've got to do some specific things technologically that allow you to hit these levels, and we'll be doing that in a video that's coming out here in a couple weeks. The leaders, what are the leaders doing differently with that 8.8% growth rate there? They are prioritizing IT transformation at 135% higher priority than average retailers. They're focusing on lowering the supply chain costs at 145% higher priority. Associate training and tools, 194% higher. Inventory visibility, prioritizing that 55% higher. And then the clienteling and assisted selling, 26% higher investment in priority than the average retailers in these areas. I can't overestimate the importance of the IT transformation, the lowering the supply chain, and the associate training. Those three there, they are actually critical to what IT can do to help improve the customer experience. In our final chart here, you don't have to beat Amazon or beat Walmart or beat Target or beat Kroger. You simply have to out-invest and out-execute your competitors, your weakest competitors within your segments. Unfortunately, the failure rate of some large retailers who are not willing to transform themselves leaves such a gap that the players that are and the smaller upstarts that are growing like crazy can simply vacuum that up. However, the gap is bigger than that any one retailer can vacuum up, and that includes Amazon. Okay, so as people drop out of a marketplace or close stores because of either bad management, a bad business model, overexpansion, whatever the cause may be, or competition, that gap is bigger than any one player is going to do. So those who are willing to do that, to invest in that technology, are going to be the ones that are going to not only survive, they're going to thrive because the market has already been primed and they just need to come in. It's kind of almost like lead generation. You've already primed the pump for customers to buy the products, and then they got out of the marketplace, so it's more for everybody else. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly for Q&A and to organize that.
Thank you. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the interface on the sidebar. I have been tracking them as we've gone through this presentation. So to start out, I will start with a question from, I believe it's Michael Lehman. Do your studies indicate that specialty retail appears to be growing faster than traditional mainstream retailers? In theory, specialty retail is smaller with smaller budgets, but greater touch points with the end customer. Greg, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. I want to make sure I understand the question. Specialty retail overall, I wouldn't say it's growing faster or greater than the others in there. What you've got is you've got smaller retailers that are growing faster, because if you've got 50 stores and you add one, you've literally gone up more than if you had 500 and added one. So the fact that that growth percentage is higher, it also is the fact that we have a benefit with the smaller retailers is they don't have legacy. So just the same way, if everybody read The World is Flat by, what was his name again? The World is Flat.
Tom Friedman?
Tom Friedman, yeah. We learned about technology and how third world or upcoming countries didn't have to deal with plain old telephone lines when it came to the internet. They could go to straight wireless or they could go to fiber right away because they didn't have that. Many of these small up-and-coming guys don't have to deal with legacy. They can do everything in the cloud and don't have to deal with that. So that also allows them to expand much faster because they don't have to take on the capital expense for IT systems and other things as well. So I hope that answered that question.
I'll go and take a question for Lee here. Some of our systems are cloud-enabled, mostly infrastructure systems. What retail-specific systems would you prioritize for the cloud?
That's a great question, because there's some retailers that simply said, okay, put everything in the cloud, and boom, they're done. Basically, the jump start that Greg talked about earlier, the key thing you want to keep in mind is you want to get a unified view of your customer. You also want to have a unified view of the order as it progresses through the enterprise, as well as the inventory that is associated with that order. These are the two key things that you really need to have when you're talking about the cloud enablement and being able to jumpstart an enterprise. The thing that's really interesting is the thing that retailers need to keep in mind is putting something into the cloud in such a manner makes the cloud solution much stickier. And that's a good thing for vendors, obviously. But it's something that retailers need to keep in mind, because if you get to the point where you're not willing to do this anymore, it gets turned off and it's instant, as opposed to having legacy systems in place.
Great. And then actually I'm going to go right over to another question that kind of pertains to the unified commerce from Ken. Are those retailers that are opening stores taking the opportunity to open those stores with new technology to enable the omni-channel, or just using legacy systems?
I think it varies on the particular retailer that's opening the stores and where they are with things. There are some who are using those open stores to be the new launching pad for things, and then there are others that are just opening stores with their systems in place. The challenge of making a change while you're opening new stores, on the one hand, it's great. You can experiment and you can play with the new technology and keep it isolated there. The downside is you then are managing multiple systems as you go through there. So that's one of the reasons why you see somebody like a Home Depot or one of those guys will roll out all their point of sale systems in 6 months across 1,500 stores for that, because it's easier for them to manage one solution and roll it out than it is to have multiple solutions that are in place. Whereas a grocery store, because the margins are so low, they may take 3 years to open up half as many stores with new technology. So if they make a switch, they've got to manage multiple systems for that period of time, which means every system that touches that point of sale system has to be managed twice. Every update needs to be managed twice. EMV has to be managed twice. So it really varies based on the retailer and where they are in pretty much the IT maturity curve for key technologies.
Okay, then I have a question here from Mark. He has a couple questions, actually. Given the growth of online sales at most retailers, wouldn't one expect to see more store closings as part of rationalization and smarter business models?
You may, but you may also see these stores actually move to being warehouses and fulfillment centers for online purchases. What's the one advantage that many of the retailers have over Amazon and other e-commerce retailers is proximity to the customers. That's the primary reason I believe that Amazon bought Whole Foods, was to get actually closer to that last mile delivery for their products that are bought online, not so much to just get into the grocery business that's there. So retailers have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to fulfill online orders locally from their stores, or what we're seeing in Europe, we have dark stores that are completely set up as retail stores, but they're not open to the customer. They're just there for shipping locally. And then we're also seeing ship from store, so we had ship from store, we have dark stores, and then fulfillment houses, sections of the warehouse or specific warehouses that are designed specifically as fulfillment for online. I think you're going to see a mix of all those depending on the segment and where this may be.
And you can't ignore the aspect of returns there as well.
Yes.
We have another question coming in from Shelley Bosler. Are you seeing retailers using technology to eliminate employees or reallocating them to customer-facing activities? Are they just trying to shrink to greatness with their labor force?
No, actually, I do not see that happening at the store level. We're seeing a bit of automation happening, particularly in the UPC-based businesses that are out there. So your grocery stores, your super centers, your warehouse clubs, your mass merchants, at their DCs, a lot of automation, artificial intelligence, robotics there. But at the store level, what we're seeing is technology being deployed to free up labor, not necessarily reduce the labor, but to do things. One of the studies that we did, Shelley, earlier this year is we looked at 30 different technologies. Kelly's been doing these video series on the technologies that move the sales needle. And one of those technologies was ship from store or click and collect. And we asked retailers, are any of you making money on that yet? And the answer was no. And the opportunity is there to make a huge dent in labor hours there. I'm a firm believer. A firm believer in RFID technology is the key thing that allows ship from store, click and collect to actually work for a couple reasons. One, the return on investment is really, really quick with some of the new technologies coming out. Two, it frees up a lot of labor, and that labor can now go do the click and collect, and they can go out and meet customer orders and do those sort of things. Historically, when retailers reduce labor out of their stores, when they take labor out of their stores, they begin to fail. A perfect example is self-checkout. Self-checkout was ideal for removing labor from the particular thing because you would take 4 checkout lanes and condense it to one person there in most cases. In some cases, you would do up to 16 lanes down to one person. The retailers that simply removed labor, like Kmart, they failed miserably at self-checkout. Those who took their best cashiers and trained customers how to use them and then took those other employees and put them in other areas that were profit centers, because let's face it, a cashier's job in a grocery store is not to upsell when somebody comes through, but to process as fast as possible. Those retailers like Kroger that moved to prepared foods, moved those to taste testers around the store, actually increased their margins dramatically when they deployed self-checkout because they didn't reduce the labor in the store. So, I mean, retailers can do that. It's foolhardy, in my opinion, because the data over time has shown that they fail.
Let's go a question for Lee. There was a report that a shopping mall in Ohio is being transformed into an Amazon fulfillment center. Do you see this trend continuing?
Short answer, yes. I mean, the types of things that we were talking about earlier, and the shopping malls, within 5 miles of each other, the brand new build, all that kind of thing. It's those things are going to have to be repurposed somehow. Whether it's a sales effort by the owner of the mall, or whether it's a entrepreneur that comes in and says, "Hey, I want to do this in your mall. What do you think? Can we give it a try?" It's kind of like what happens with the Olympics. When a host city hosts the Olympics, they build all these new infrastructure and buildings and facilities and so forth, and then the crowds come and the games happen, and then the crowds leave. I mean, what do you do with this brand new gymnasium? You're not going to have games in it every single night. So I think malls are going to have to rethink how they view the properties that they own, whether it's fulfillment houses, whether it's, in some cases we're talking about, residential type situations. The long story short, malls are going to have to work real hard to not only figure out how they populate the empty spaces that are going to show up, but also they've got to do a better job of working with the retailers that are still there. One of the things we've talked about is the fact that there's so many retailers that complain about the internet service that they get in a shopping mall, because they're dependent upon the property manager for that. And in order to do the kinds of things they want to do with the cloud, they simply can't get enough bandwidth. So malls need to do a better job of relating to the retailers that they already have in place, and then do a better job of bringing somebody in that can supplement what's going on there.
Great. Well, and we still have questions coming in, but unfortunately we do need to wrap this up. So that'll conclude our webinar for today. For those of you who asked questions that we didn't get to, we will have one of the panelists reach out to you with those answers. And thank you all again for taking time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate it.